You don't want the upper control arm to pop up when you remove this castle nut. See, I definitely should have put more weight on that. My castle nut went flying. All right, so now we're going to support, hey, no, big no time. No, inside, go inside, let's go inside. Hey guys, it's Chloe, welcome back, or welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be lifting this 2020 Tacoma TRD Pro. The suspension lift that we did on this truck was definitely a unique one, and it was also a really fun one to do, so let's just get right into the video. A lot of people that have TRD Pro Tacomas want to lift their trucks for better ground clearance or to run larger tires. But at the same time, straight out of the factory, one of the best things about the TRD Pro is that you get a really great suspension setup. This is the only trim in the Tacoma currently that you get Fox coilovers and shocks that are TRD tuned. They have a wider body than any of the other stock shocks that come on the other trims on the 3rd gen Tacoma by about 1 inch, and they ride amazing. The TRD Pro definitely rides the best on and off-road out of any of the other trims out there, in my opinion. So the problem is with a lot of TRD Pro owners is they want to lift these trucks but obviously keep their awesome Fox suspension. Now of course you can definitely get a lift by just using blocks and spacers, but those can introduce a lot of problems, especially if you do a lot of hard wheeling off-road, and you definitely have a higher chance of bottoming out, which is not great. So there's this company called Westcott Designs that actually makes a special kit specifically for these TRD Pro shocks that allows you to adjust the preload on your coilover, giving your TRD Pro a lift. From the description on their website about this kit, they say that this is not a spacer lift. This lift does not change the geometry of the factory suspension. This kit will not limit factory travel or extend travel past factory. Your ride quality isn't compromised in any way, and this kit includes everything you'll need. You don't need to replace upper control arms, and you can run up to a 33-inch tire without a body chop. You'll kind of see what they mean by that and how this is possible, because we're going to be installing that exact kit on our 2020 Tacoma TRD Pro today, and on the front coilovers we're going to have to remove the spring and add a new adjustment collar on the shock. So it is going to be quite a bit of work, but I think this is a great alternative because you're going to get a suspension lift and keep these awesome Fox shocks. I also took measurements before we installed this lift when the truck was back on the ground, so we'll see how much extra height we get in the front. Now let's get into the fun part, the install, and let me show you everything you'll need. So you guys, this wasn't too difficult if you know how to remove front coilovers from these trucks, or you've done it multiple times like I have on your own truck, but I really think the harder part here was taking apart the coilover and reassembling it with this specific kit, because I had never done that before. So my friend Kyle actually came over and helped me do the first shock and showed me how to remove the spring and everything, and I also actually didn't have a spring compressor, so he came in clutch for that. So of course I'll be showing you guys everything for this install in detail, and like most of my videos, Cody also made sure to help out too, so you'll see him throughout this video if you want to watch all the way through. So as I'm filming this portion, we already lifted one side of the truck, and I'm going to show you guys how we lift the other side, and I have everything laid out here that we use to lift our first side. So this is essentially everything you'll be needing, plus what comes in the Westcott's design kit. First up, we got a couple of spacers over here. Now, we're going a little bit rogue in this video. We're not going to follow this kit to a T, because our idea with what we want to do with this truck is we want to lift it as minimally as possible to run 285 tires. So this spacer is a component in this kit that's supposed to go on top of the shock that is going to give us extra height, but we're not going to install this part for now because we want to see where the height sits at. Although this may be something we end up putting on when we get the 285 tires if we need to. The kit also comes with 3 new nuts for the top plate of your shock, and this is a critical component of this kit. It is the adjustment collar. So this is the stock adjustment collar that comes on the TRD Pro shocks, and basically we're going to replace this part with this part in the Westcott's design kit. So you can see that there's a pretty significant height difference, and this is going to adjust our preload a little bit more, compress our spring, and give us more height out of the shock. One thing I wanted to mention is that this Westcott's design kit didn't come with any written instructions or any pointers to where there were instructions on how to install this. So you have to go to their website for instructions or YouTube and follow it that way. Now, the rest of this stuff are tools we'll need to remove the shock from the truck, and some tools we'll need to take apart our coilover. So first up, you will need a spring compressor because we are taking that spring off of that strut. You'll also need some WD-40 to make the removement of the existing collar easier. To actually remove the shock from the truck, there's a couple of different ways you can do it, but I like removing the spindle from the upper control arm, so you'll need a hammer and or a mallet to do that. You'll also need a new cotter pin and some needle nose pliers, a breaker bar, and also a torque wrench, which I don't have here, but you'll definitely need that. I have a ratchet, a 14mm, 17mm, and 19mm wrench, some alignment bars that can come in handy if you have issues getting the bottom portion of the shock out, and then a bunch of various socket sizes that I'll have listed as we're doing the install. And to make my life easier, I have my Makita gun. Now, the correct socket size, or the best socket size to use on these stock lugs on these Tacoma, is a 21mm socket. So get your breaker bar out. Now, people sometimes in my videos ask me why I just break these on the ground and not just remove the lug nuts completely. And really, I know this probably doesn't make a huge difference, but I just don't want the weight of the wheel sitting on the threads. So this is the way I do it. So I break everything while the tire is still touching the ground, and I just like sticking to this method. Now, I want to show you this thing. This is the key for a wheel lock. So if you have wheel locks like this truck does, you basically screw this down until it locks in place on the lug nut with a lock, and then a 21mm socket fits right over that. So now this is lifted up enough where I can move the wheel freely. Take my jack stand and ease it onto the jack stand. Alright, so again, my favorite method of doing this after having done it several times on these 3rd gen Tacomas is when we're removing these coilovers, I want to remove the spindle from the upper control arm. That's how I'm gonna get this coilover out. I know there are people out there, based on the comments on my previous videos and just how the Westcott's designs video instructions are, that like to remove the lower control arm instead. Now, while that might make life easier to remove this shock, I still find this method to be pretty easy and foolproof. And one of the other issues with removing the lower control arm is the possibility of adjusting the caster. So you should get an alignment no matter what after replacing these shocks, but to minimize that, we're just gonna remove this shock through the upper control arm and spindle. So if you want to go the lower control arm route, definitely check out the Westcott video itself. But the first thing I'm going to do is remove this cotter pin, because we're going to remove this castle nut on the spindle. And before we remove this castle nut, I'm also going to remove this 10mm bolt that's holding in our ABS or brake line. We're also going to remove our sway bar link from our spindle, and that is a 17mm. So I'm going to be using a breaker bar for that. Now we're going to separate our upper control arm from our spindle. So the first step to do is to loosen our castle nut, and we're going to use a 19mm socket for that. This thing has quite a bit of rust, just surface rust, I think. Probably because in its first life, it was an East Coast truck. Wow, I can even see some green corrosion on the surface of that castle nut. I think I have an extra one, so I'll just replace it after, and I'll show you guys it when we take it off. But the key right now is we don't want to take it off completely because we want to separate the spindle, obviously, from the upper control arm, and we don't want our spindle coming down because we have nothing holding it up. So now's the fun part where we're going to use our hammer to separate these two, and I've tried using a mallet in the past and I've had no luck. So I've resorted to a hammer. You can see that there's this flat section right here, and that's where exactly you want to be hitting it. Oh, I did it. That was faster than how it usually goes. Now we're going to loosen up our sway bars. So there's two 14mm bolts. So now, as you can see, this makes our sway bar like 10 times easier to maneuver around, and that's gonna help us when we actually need to pull the shock out. All right, now we're going to remove this lower shock nut right here, which is a 19mm. Now we're gonna remove the 3 nuts that are holding the top of the shock in. By the way, I will have torque specs when we're torquing everything at the kind of end of the install. All right, now we're actually going to remove this castle nut, which again is a 19mm socket, and this is actually going to separate our upper control arm and our spindle. So the key here is you don't want the upper control arm to pop up when you remove this castle nut. So make sure you put some weight on it with your hand. See, I definitely should have put more weight on that. My castle nut went flying. So here's the castle nut with a lot of surface rust. You can even see it's green from all the corrosion. Right, so now we're going to support, hey, no, big no time. No, inside, go inside, let's go inside.
A little later.
All right, so we're going to take our jack up here and we're going to put some support under the control arm. This is so that we can actually remove this lower shock bolt. By the way, this floor jack I'm using is a Pro Eagle jack. This is their 2-ton jack. It's actually also like supposed to be an off-road jack. It's really awesome. I have Pro Eagle's 2-ton jack and their 1.5-ton jack. The 1.5-ton is great for the Tacoma. I keep it in the back of my truck for trails and stuff, but the 2-ton is nice to have for around the garage. So I just keep this one in the garage. Now I'm removing this lower shock bolt. So there's the lower shock bolt. Now I think we should have enough clearance to actually remove this shock. Now I've had trouble doing it myself in the past, and having an extra person is sometimes nice. Let's see if I can remove it myself. There we go. So a little bit of awkward maneuvering, but we got it out. All right, so now that we have our coilover off the truck and on our work table, what essentially we're going to do is we're going to take steps to remove this black piece over here, this stock collar on these shocks, and replace it with this one from Westcott Designs. Now, the other side wasn't like this, so I have a question for you guys, especially anyone who has had this kit before. Did your collars from Westcott Designs come looking like this? This side, I don't know if you can see in the light, but there's like ridges besides all the scrapes on the side at the top here, as if this has been used before, which kind of isn't cool if you're spending, you know, $300–400 on this kit, and this is pretty much one of the main components, but we're still going to use it. So anyways, step 1 is to remove the coil or the spring from the strut. Now this can be kind of dangerous because we're going to be using a spring compressor, and if you don't use these things properly, you can really hurt yourself. So if you're doing this, be very careful and just take extra caution. All right, so this part's a little bit scary, so I have Kyle behind me supervising, but the main thing here is when you do this, you want to make sure that these are exactly on the opposite sides of each other. And obviously you also want to make sure they're straight. So we're going to go really slowly and tighten these down. Be extremely careful.
It doesn't need much because we're just removing it, but installing it is a little bit different.
Sure, that makes sense. Now, if you guys also use an impact driver like we are, make sure, again, you're extremely careful. There's a lot of people that say you shouldn't do this when you use a spring compressor because you can overdo it, so just go really, really slowly. So now we're going to remove this nut, but first I'm going to spray some WD-40 on these threads. And now we're going to remove this 17mm nut. So I'm going to loosen up these clamps a little bit. Then once we safely have those off, we can separate the strut from the spring. Okay, so now we have to take off the existing shock collar. So to do that, Westcott Designs recommends you spray a little WD-40 around this. Then we're going to take our mallet and simply try to hammer it off. Alright, so we cleaned our components and now it's time to kind of piece everything back together, but we're going to use the new collar. The hard thing though is when we put our spring back on, we're obviously going to have to compress it. Alright, so once we've got our spring compressed, which honestly was quite a bit of work, we can put our top hat or top plate on. You might be able to see the rubber is kind of indented right here, and that's where you need to twist it to, because that's where the top plate is supposed to go. Now we put our bushing on, washer. So now you can see at this point we have a couple of threads showing, so we're good. Now we can actually remove our spring compressor. Again, super, super careful, go a little bit at a time with this. One removed and one to go. This one is kind of jammed up against the body. There we go. We got our new shock with our new collar installed. Again, you can see our stem has a couple of threads, so this shock is ready to go back on the truck. Okay, now it's time to put the shock back in. All right, first things first, secure your nuts on your top hat or top plate so that at least the shock can get held in place. So now I'm using an alignment bar to get the lower portion of the shock just in place. All right, so now that I got the lower shock aligned, we're gonna put this lower shock bolt in. And then the washer and nut back into place. So we'll torque everything to spec in a little bit. Now I'm gonna reconnect my spindle and my upper control arm. Now I'm going to tighten this castle nut. I can't remember if I mentioned, but this is a new castle nut. I replaced the old one. It had quite a bit of surface rust on it. Now we're going to put our sway bar link back into our spindle. Reconnect our nut for our sway bar link. And this is a 17mm socket. Then we're going to reconnect this bracket that's holding it in this line and our 10mm bolt. So now we're going to torque all our bolts down to spec. Now, unfortunately, I totally forgot, but when you connect the sway bar links, it gets in the way of the torque wrench and this castle nut, so I had to remove them really quickly, but I'll put them back on right after I torque this castle nut. And then once our castle nut is kind of aligned so we can put our cotter pin in, we're gonna do that. We're gonna bend this guy down. So now we can actually reconnect our sway bar link. We're gonna torque this guy too now. We're gonna torque our lower shock bolt. I added an extension since I was kind of hitting the rotor. Now we can't forget that we did disconnect our sway bar. So those are two 14mm bolts. All right, so here is the TRD Pro, finished with the Westcott Designs front lift. Well, sort of. We did not do the top spacer. We just did the adjustable collar. And I don't know if you guys can tell because it's hard to see the truck in full frame. My garage isn't huge, so this is the best view I can give you. But just from my own naked eye, I can see the entire truck. And the front is definitely a little bit higher than the rear, but at the same time, it needs to be driven around and it needs to settle. But I think it's going to be pretty good. And just out of curiosity, let me measure it. All right, so before, I think this side was like 35.5, and now it's sitting at 37. And just to give you a comparison in the rear, oh, we're sitting just under 37. So the front is a tad higher, but again, this is kind of irrelevant because it hasn't settled. So I'm gonna take it on a drive around the block and then we'll take measurements after. So after a quick test drive, the truck definitely feels a little bit different. It mostly just feels a little bit higher, but the suspension itself feels the same, which is good. The lift settled a little bit after our test drive, so in the very beginning, before we even did this lift, the front end was about 35.5 inches and the rear was 36.5 inches. And now, after our test drive and after the truck has settled, the front measures out to be around 36 inches and the rear is the same at 36.5 inches. So overall, we gained about a 1/2 inch, and I think that top spacer, if we used it, would give us an extra 1/2 inch to an inch. And we'll see when we get the 285s if we actually need them or not. I think a lot of times when people think about fitting larger tires, they always think about the lift, but I also think it's a lot about caster too. So we may need to adjust for that in order to fit the 285s, but again, we'll see. Anyways, overall, I think this Westcott lift kit is a great kit if you're looking to retain your factory TRD Pro Fox Shocks and also get a 1/2 inch to an inch and a half of lift. The only downside that I really saw with the kit today was that the shock collar that we put on the driver's side shock was definitely used. It kind of sucks to pay for a lift kit and then get used parts because you never know how those are gonna be, but luckily it seems like it worked out and I'm pretty sure it'll be fine. We will definitely have to keep you guys updated about how this lift is, but I'm curious if anyone in the comment section down below has this lift or has run this lift before on their TRD Pros. We'd be really interested to know what you think. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to connect more with me, I do have an Instagram that you can follow. It is at ChloeKuoTaco. But other than that, I hope I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.